Even kijken. En dan...
Even, mocht je tussendoor vragen
Ja.
hebben, zet ze even in de chat. Er zijn wat momenten tussendoor waarin we die vragen ook kunnen behandelen. Dus schroom niet ondertussen al wat leuke dingen zo ertussen te zetten.
Yeah. Okay, great. So the plan is for me to talk for about 30 minutes. I hope maybe even shorter, but it might be 5 minutes longer. I'm going to try to keep it short so that there will be lots of opportunities for you to respond and ask questions. I call this caught between a dike and a wet place, and that's an allusion to a saying that you may know called caught between a rock and a hard place. And that refers to, being in a situation where both choices aren't great. It's a difficult position to be in. That actually comes from American labor history. It's coal miners who were working in a mine and under really terrible conditions, and then they considered whether to strike, but they knew if they struck, they would probably suffer also. And so that was for them being caught between a rock and a hard place. I think the Netherlands is caught between a dike and a wet place. And as you can see from the Deltares cartoons, I think that the Netherlands is caught between the choice, the choice between zeewaarts or meebewegen. It seems to me those are the two fundamental national options or strategies, and it's a difficult place to be in. Working on this Resilient by Design MRA project really brought that home for me, how very, very difficult it is for city planners, designers, engineers, and watervakkundigen and so on, to make that decision to think beyond the year 2050. It's really difficult. Okay, so it's an outsider's perspective on this dilemma. I'm going to present a series of, I think, 6 observations, and then that will be followed by some recommendations for unprecedented action. I first want to create the frame for this, and the frame is the climate emergency. Everything I do at the University of Pennsylvania begins from the climate emergency, and I don't let anyone ever forget that. My teaching, my research, my interactions with the administration, everything begins from the climate emergency. I have a feeling in the Netherlands that's not always the case. Well, not always the case. I don't think the climate emergency is as prominent in people's consciousness as perhaps it ought to be. And I wondered, it's just an idle thought, I wondered about whether the Dutch have a good word for unprecedented. I got a lot of mileage out of this word. It's the word that was used in the IPCC special report published in 2018. That we need to undertake unprecedented change. We have a 15-year window to do so. That was in 2018. I looked at the news headlines across, I asked Facebook friends to tell me what they were seeing in their countries. The Germans translated unprecedented as nie dagewesene Veränderungen. And I found in the Netherlands, in a way that is not really going to catch on. I don't think it's a great translation. I mean, it gets the meaning right, but I don't think this is going to catch on. Niet eerder vertoonde maatregelen. So niet eerder vertoond. That's, it seems to be what that newspaper settled on for a translation for unprecedented. But unprecedented is really, really important. It means you have to think outside of what your routines sort of responses are. You need new, innovative, unprecedented strategies and ideas in order to deal with the situation. Okay, so here's observation number 1, or rather dilemma number 1. Are we talking centuries? Are we talking meters? Or are we talking Celsius? Celsius is easy, 1.5, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. That's the range that we're working, 4 plus. Right now we're steering towards 4 plus Celsius. That's a lot, and that's catastrophic. but that's a range that we're familiar with. Then there's meters, of course. You know, is it going to be 85 centimeters by the end of the century, which is what the Netherlands worked with for the longest time? Is it going to be 1.5? Is it going to be 2? Is it going to be 3, 5, 6, 7, etc.? Those numbers are out there as well. What I notice in the Netherlands, more so than I see in other places, is this enormous temporal wiggle room that is used. 2050 seems to be the limit for planning. 2100 is, that one's obvious. That one's a number that's used the world over. 2120, that comes in with Van Wageningen, right? That's Martin Baptiste and Natuurlijke Toekomst voor Nederland 2120. Then there's 2200, that's Lola Landscape, Plan B. And then there was Blauwe Kamer with 2300. I understand that these numbers, you know, having these numbers projected far, far into the future, you know, it mitigates the anxiety that one might feel with regard to accelerated sea level rise. And as Ko said a couple of weeks ago in the video I heard, we hebben nog even tijd iets te doen. And that we hear that a lot, right? And I think that that's what happens when you work with these numbers. You get this idea, oh, it's okay, we hebben nog even tijd. But when people say we hebben nog even tijd iets te doen, I hear we hebben nog even tijd niets te doen. Because as far as I can tell, for the most part, this just results in nothing happening. So it removes the urgency that is required for unprecedented action. So what should planners do? I think planners and overmorgen, I think that you should forget the shifting, uncertain temporal timeline and focus on meters. This is from Michael Oppenheimer. He's a professor at Princeton, and he is the lead author for the IPCC on sea level rise. And in this study from 2019, which comes out through the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, the Potsdamer, the peak, very important. Our findings support the use of scenarios of 21st century global warming total sea level rise exceeding 2 meters for planning purposes. So that seems to me a good idea, to fix on meters and say 2 meters plus by 2100, coming from a very reliable source. Let's build that into our thinking. All right. Next dilemma, the numbers game. Are we talking about 2, 3, 4, or 6 scenarios? I just want to run through these very briefly. The one on the left that you see there, that's Deltares. I don't know if you saw the original. This came out in 2016, November of 2016. As you can see, there were 3, and I thought that was very interesting. There was beschermd, what eventually they called beschermd gesloten, beschermd open, and what would become meebewegen. At this early point, they had not yet figured out that they could map these onto the IPCC typologies. What Marjolein Haasnoot was trying to convey with these cartoons was, you know, an exaggerated sense of what each of these solutions meant or implied, and in 2 cases, the top 2, to convey a message of dat is toch te gek, right? So Fortress Netherlands over here, you know, with these enormous pumps pumping out these huge rivers into the sea, dat is toch te gek. And, you know, to make river autobahnen here in order, you know, to keep it open, but then to have the polders, you know, sinking into caves, essentially, you know, that's also te gek. What was interesting was that among designers, initially, number 3 was most appealing. People thought that was very, very interesting. Okay, I also noticed, and I think this is important, I noticed that this trio of options corresponded to the same trio of options that Deltares presented to Indonesia and the city of Jakarta. In the sense that there were three. So what you're looking at here is the NCICD, the National Capital Integrated Coastal Development Project of 1914 at that point. And it's a somewhat similar story. It was you can do nothing and then everything is inundated. I guess that's sort of number three. You can build a wall and keep the water out, but then you sink. So you're looking at this. Or you can do something innovative, and that wound up being the Great Garuda Seawall Project. You can build this seawall, and then you have a big waduk or polder, retention basin in the bay of the Sea of Java. All right, so that was what the Indonesians were presented with, three. But as you know, Deltares modified that, and they added zeewaarts, with another cartoon, an exceptionally busy cartoon. It looks to be the one that's most sort of bustling with life. It probably is, in a sense, the most Dutch of these. But let's not be mistaken about this. Zeewaarts is still gesloten, right? It's still gesloten. It still involves a huge, huge seawall, just like Garuda, essentially, with these huge freshwater retention basins and pumps, massive, massive pumps to drain, the rivers that flow into the south of the Netherlands. All right, so that was added, zeewaarts. So now we're at 4, and that somewhat seems to correspond to at least where the IPCC was at that time. But I want to show you something interesting that Deltares did. I think it's indicative of something. Deltares decided that meebewegen and terugtrekken, because terugtrekken is also a strategy, retreat, that they were naar verwachting in combinatie uitgevoerd zal worden. Zijn deze strategieën samengevoegd enzovoort. But what I'm noticing is that terugtrekken disappears, right? You have meebewegen, and whereas the IPCC had retreat as one discrete solution, Deltares puts meebewegen and terugtrekken together and then has meebewegen sort of cover terugtrekken so that you don't even talk about it. You don't see the word at all, even though it is sort of implied. Okay, I'm very interested in retreat. In the United States, this is an open conversation, somewhat controversial, but it's gaining a lot of momentum because there are a lot of vulnerable coastal cities, and retreat and managed retreat seems to be something that we should be talking about. Rolf Schuttenhelm, one of your reporters, I think he is one of the only ones I see writing about retreat. And he even found a Dutch translation for managed retreat. It's down here, gecontroleerde terugtrekking. You may have heard that for the first time now in Dutch. I don't think it caught on. My sense of Rolf Schuttenhelm is that his language just is not in tune with Dutch discourse. He writes, very intelligently about these things, but I don't think he does so in a way that it gets taken up in the discourse. Lola approached terugtrekken very directly. In this slide, which this is actually taken in Erik Jan's office. I went to interview him about a year ago, and he showed me this slide, and it was like, I've got to take a picture of this slide. The Great Migration. I thought, oh, wow, that's incredible. He has openly stated and shown, what's involved in this idea. I was interested too in the fact that he used the word Great Migration, because that is a term from American history. It refers to the migration of African Americans from the South to the North over about a 60-year period. A 60-year period. 7 million African Americans moved from the South where they were subject to discrimination of a severe sort, to the north, where they were subject to discrimination of a less severe sort, more opportunities. That's the Great Migration. And at first, when I thought about it, I thought, oh, Eric Jan, you're being so culturally insensitive. How can you use that term? But I think that he's not wrong. It's because it has to do with this. We think of, managed retreat. This is going to be managed retreat over how short a period? The point is, it's not over a short period, it's over a longer period, but it has to happen. So I think that the idea of the Great Migration, that's worth thinking about. And so he avoided the term terugtrekking altogether. He says verhuizen. That's all that's happening. We verhuizen. And he thinks that we can make a virtue out of this problem and really begin to innovate and become world's leaders in verhuizen. Okay, quickly, this is IPCC now. They have 6 options. They added no response as an option and ecosystem-based adaptation. I think the important thing to realize is that this is a toolbox and you can put these things together in combination, etc. But none of these is a national strategy necessarily. Whereas for the Netherlands, I think it does come down to a choice about fundamental choice about 2 national strategies. Either Zeewaarts or meebewegen. Those are the 2 options. And that's a very, very difficult position to be in. Okay. I threw this slide in because I think it's important. The situation in Netherlands is or is not like the situation in Indonesia. When Ko was speaking, Kalimantan and Jakarta came up and Ko assured everybody, Nederland is toch niet Indonesië, of Randstad is niet Jakarta. But I'm not so convinced that that's the case. And I think that the Dutch have this really awkward post-colonial way of sealing themselves off from this comparison. And I think it's a comparison that's important to make for a number of reasons. One is that whatever happens in Jakarta is happening in large measure too because of the Netherlands, because of a colonial history. But, the plans for the NCICD, they were originated in the Deltares office, right? So the Dutch are all over this through their partnership with the Netherlands. With Indonesia. But there's more to it than that. This is about Kalimantan. Yeah, I do want to also call attention to this just briefly. Ko mentioned it, there is a plan to move the capital of the government, the capital city, from Jakarta to Kalimantan on Borneo, on another island. And there's a lot of talk about this as if it were some kind of progressive solution. The radical plan to save the fastest sinking city. Jakarta is not going to be saved. The plan is to move something like 1.5 million people out of a mega city of over 30 million people to Kalimantan to live in a beautiful, smart forest city. But the rest of Jakarta, bereft of its government, is just going to continue to sink, and industry will move out as it tends to do, as it determines it's no longer viable there, and the poor and vulnerable will be left. So this is not a solution. This doesn't save Jakarta in the slightest. It puts Jakarta in an even more vulnerable position. However, it does involve contemplating moving the government, and that's something I want to return to later. A little bit more about Indonesia. I was involved in the Water as Leverage program that Henk Ovink initiated for Bangladesh, India, and Indonesia. In Indonesia, we were in Semarang. I was with Matthijs Bouw, One Architecture, same as with RBD MRA. And this was the call for action initially, the first announcement about it. And you can see that for Semarang, it said from pond to polder, as if polder were sort of where the goal, where you wanted to get to. Now, I also want to point out that if you are a Dutch agency or Dutch institution, and you are talking about Indonesia, your former colony, and you make a map which is red, white, and blue, that is very, very culturally obtuse. I'm just astonished at this decision. But there it was, from pond to polder. Um, and I asked Henk Ofing to explain why he called it from pond to polder. You see it there below. It comes from the bigger challenges Semarang faces, integrated water management approaches, the necessity, etc. And so it sounds like, you know, polder is that sort of integrated approach. But when the detailed call for action came out, I noticed that they dropped that. And there was this incredible question posed in the midst. Is it sustainable to build a hard coastal defense infrastructure in a place that is drastically sinking? Or is it eventually more feasible to retreat and partially move the city to higher ground? I was stunned to read that, because that question applies to the Netherlands just as well, right? And Henk, I hate to say it, I mean, there was no preparation, ground preparation, you know, in Semarang for this question. It just came out of the blue and said, hey, Semarang, maybe you want to move a few 100,000 people out of there up to a higher place. What do you think? That's not, you know, Semarang, the city, just ignored this question. Essentially, it was, you know, it was out there, but it was pushed to the side of the table, and for understandable reasons. You can't just throw that question out there. You have to do a lot of work to get there, right? So the fact that in the Netherlands there is this resistance to thinking about meebewegen and what Lola is proposing and others, that's not surprising. But I think that the process in the Netherlands, starting with Deltares, is much more thought out and is moving along a certain path, which is heading somewhere. So it's sort of semi-coordinated and it's strategic, and I think it's very worth following. Okay, 4, migration is, oh goodness, migration is or isn't connected to adaptation. I think this is a really, really important thing. In the Netherlands, my sense is most people separate these things, whether they do so, you know, out of conviction or pragmatically, or you know, or simply because they don't even make the connection. But it's very, very important. I'm going to refer to 2 sort of interventions that I think are very, very interesting. One is Sjoerd Kroeskamp's need. I hope you've heard of this. This is the Northern European Enclosure Dam, you know, which would create essentially an enormous retention basin between England and Norway and France and the Netherlands, so that all of those millions and millions of people would be safe. But of course, it would involve maintaining a very low sort of freshwater table. And as sea level rises to 6-7 meters, etc., you have this enormous wall going up. And of course, you're pumping and pumping to keep water levels where they, you know, at pale, essentially. And Sjoerd did this crazy, crazy study in order to expose this insight. Uh, uh, Are you opposed to solutions such as need? Then contribute to climate mitigation now. So the point is, he says, this is really te gek. He took that te gek idea of Deltares and said, this is really crazy. And if you don't want to contemplate this craziness, then mitigate. You really have to. Also, Bregman's Het Water komt. The point of his argument, as far as on my reading, is to drive home the connection with greenhouse gas, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That the link, the connection between mitigation and adaptation is very serious. So hier, this is Bregman. Eén ding staat als een paal boven water. We moeten wereldwijd de uitstoot van broeikasgassen zo snel mogelijk naar nul brengen. De deltaplan van onze tijd gaat over zonnepanelen en windmolens, flitstreinen en megabatterijen. And so I think he's right about that. And that connection, we have to hang on to that. Schuttenhelm, in another article, asks a very important question regarding adaptation. Who pays the bill? And he points out that North Sea natural gas financed the Delta works. And then the question is, will NLA's, will the Netherlands sea level rise adaptation be financed by fracking in my state? Shell is opening an enormous plastic processing plant where they're going to use the gases, methane and other gases from fracking in my state in order to produce, just unbelievable amounts of plastic pellets. That's Shell. And, just the other day, just this Monday, at the Klimaatdag, Shell had the place of honor. So to the outsider, it seems very much as if the Netherlands is planning to finance its climate adaptation through fossil fuel, continued fossil fuel investment. So I think that that's a really big problem. That will come back to bite the Netherlands, I think. Another important thing to take into consideration is the thing that Marjolein Haasnoot keeps driving at, and that is that she puts Antarctica on the Netherlands map. She just will not let people in the Netherlands forget that Antarctica is very close when it comes to sea level rise. So there are several articles of hers that point this out. This sort of Deltares info map, which is very instructive, whatever it is, infographic, which is very instructive also about energy use for, doing all these climate adaptation things. But the point is, Antarctica is becoming increasingly unstable. And, we may well be at the point where over a period of time, we're already baked in 6 to 7 meters of sea level rise. That's something that we can't forget. Okay, de nieuwe strijd. This is Zeewaarts of meebewegen. So Lotte Jensen is a professor of cultural history at Nijmegen, and she has been working on the strijd tegen het water as a trope. And she proposes that we should think of it in terms of a nieuwe strijd, but she's very mediative. She thinks that somehow all of these things can be thought together. I think it is actually a strijd tussen zeewaarts of meebewegen. I don't think that you can somehow mediate between the two of them. Now I'm going to skip that. This just came out. She published this with her doctoral student. On the right here, Welke verhalen vertellen we? I think it's a pretty good book. I particularly like his contribution. What he says is that it's kind of striking how militarized the language is around het strijd tegen het water, right? It's a battle or a war against water. And he plays that out a little bit, and he connects it to Dutch national identity and says, as far as he can tell, and I guess there have been studies along these lines too, strijd tegen het water is an idea that sort of is culturally binding. It constitutes an important aspect of Dutch cultural identity. And therefore, if that's the case, the transition or the shift to meebewegen is very unsettling, not just because you're sacrificing land, but you're also sacrificing identity. I think he's right about it in certain ways, but I also think that it's exaggerated. People in the Netherlands have had droge voeten for a very long time. And that strijd tegen het water is pretty easy if the Rijkswaterstaat just keeps on raising the dikes. And it's easy to feel like, yeah, strijd tegen water. Oh, it's so important for our identity. But, it's the easy out. It's convenient. And there's a lot of inertia there. Meebewegen, that seems to me to be the real challenge. A challenge on the order of the old strijd tegen het water, when that was a huge challenge. Okay. I think Bregman makes a similar point. He says here, één ding is zeker. willen we ons land behouden, dan moeten we strijd leveren. Strijd tegen het water, I edit that out, en strijd tegen onszelf, tegen onze eigen appetit, tegen onze eigen zuinigheid, enzovoort. So I think that's right. This is the newest strijd. All right. So as I said, it's die tussen zeewaarts en meebewegen. Do not underestimate the antipathy against meebewegen. This is a slide from, what was it? I've forgotten now. Over in the MRA project, someone from one of the Dutch agencies put this slide on there, and I was immediately struck. Big line, red line through meebewegen and beschermen open. You know, it's understandable that that's a difficult thing to accept. But let's look at the alternative. What is zeewaarts? It's something like the Haagse Zeedijk. And if you think this one through, it's not appealing. And it could get, I mean, in the extremist form, it's Sjoerd's Northern European Enclosure Dam. When that thing exploded on the world press, most people didn't realize that Sjoerd was doing something, a sort of scientific satire. Michael Oppenheimer, to go back to him, says there's got to be a better way, like getting serious about slashing emissions, maybe, like spending $500 billion on that instead. And you can see he's sending this to Bill McKibben and to Naomi Oreskes and so on. They didn't realize that Sjoerd was actually doing a sort of version of Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal and saying, you know, let's do this. And so that people were supposed to read this and go, that's crazy. And then make the right conclusion that we have to mitigate against climate change. Instead, far too many people, I think in the Netherlands as well as outside, thought, hey, that kind of makes sense. Let's think about building this enormous enclosure. So here's a provocative idea. What if Erik Jan Pleister and Rutger de Graaf van Dinter are the Jan Leegwater and Hendrik Stevens of our time? I think there's a lot to be said for this. It's possible. Both of them are developing national strategies. They're thinking on a national level in terms of adaptation. And both of them are, in a sense, sort of reversing, but for good reason, the thinking of Leegwater and Stevens. So in that sense, they're akin, right? Both paradigm shift, and they accomplished it in the one case, but their vision stretched far into the future. And I think that both Rutger de Graaf of Blue 21 and Erik Jan of Lola Landscape are doing something similar. Both of them are also operating very strategically. Lola, I can't really evaluate all of this, but I know some things. Lola is working very closely with the WWF. This is like a very serious partnership. Excuse me, Lola, and with Deltares. Marjolein and Erik Jan, they talk. So this, I think, is really significant. I'm sure there's the PIK, which makes me very happy, and of course, and others. And here, Blue 21 working with Maren and integrating what they're doing in sort of a governmental agenda, I think that's also very significant. So I think these projects, both of them, have legs as well. Yeah, this is just to point out that Plan B from Lola explicitly requires the inhabitants of the lower parts of the country will have to move themselves and all facilities, infrastructures, and employment opportunities to the east. Along this eastern coast, the economic heart of the country will be reconstructed, right? So this is that great migration he was talking about. I'm getting close to the end now. In this presentation. Sorry about that. That's a recorded PowerPoint. Okay, just to point this out, when we talk about terugtrekken to the east, Germany, of course, arises as a sort of specter. And Patrick Nederkorn plays with that here. I'm not sure that this had much, circulated much in the Netherlands. I'm not sure if you guys were aware of it or not. He does this in German, so he does this for German audiences. And it's, of course, it's an amusing sort of cabaret piece about what happens if sea level rise drives the Dutch to the east and they spill over as climate refugees or climate migrants into Germany. I want to take that seriously. And so I'm going to float just a few ideas about what I'm going to call Terpland in contrast to Polderland. And so here are my ideas, and I'm very curious to see what you think of them. What if Overmorgen could persuade the government to float one ministry and to move another one to higher ground? Right, so float some, have a floating structure for a ministry. We've got the Global Center on Adaptation that just is doing that. Do it on a larger scale, but at the same time move a ministry symbolically, but really to the east, to higher ground. And we, of course, we have precedents for that. We've got Bonn moving to Berlin. We've got the Dutch government in exile during the Second World War, etc. Next, assess the capacity of Utrecht to tilt the country to the east. You guys understand this better than I do, but it seems to me that Utrecht has been fashioning itself as a sustainable city in a remarkable way, and that, I don't know, I think there's some sort of cultural weight and cultural capital, and there's probably real capital there, that could tilt things a little bit away from the Randstad towards the east. What about this? Thinking about developing Wageningen, Nijmegen, and Arnhem into a research triangle that cultivates cross-border ties with universities and industries in the Ruhr. So you got Köln and Düsseldorf and all of those cities in the Ruhr, all of them with fabulous universities. And, you know, so you develop, really invest and develop a research triangle, sort of like they have in North Carolina with Duke and UNC and another UNC university. And do this, and then, yeah, with universities and with industries, and then do the same thing for Maastricht, Hasselt, and Aachen, which would be like a research triangle and a Dreiländereck, similar to Freiburg, Basel, and Strasbourg. The idea here is, you know, there are many aspects to this, but the idea is to begin to think about how to work these cross-border relationships in long-term anticipation of the fact that the country is going to have to tilt to the east, and that that border has to be porous in a way that is more than just Schengen area, but that really involves working on infrastructure and sustainable housing, that, you know, crosses. Right now, I have the feeling that, you know, you can cross the border easily, but it still feels very distinct, you know. But underneath it, also historically, culturally speaking, there's a lot of stuff there that is that people there have in common. This no-aberschap thing that the Groene Amsterdammer pointed out, I think, is one of them. You know, it exists on both sides of the German and the Dutch border. Okay, and here are my recommendations. This is my last slide as well. Just a repetition, and we can just leave it here and you can ask questions or make observations. Stop measuring in decades and centuries, measure in meters. It should, you know, new housing infrastructure industry should assume a minimum of 2 meters SLR and build accordingly. Choose meebewegen, dampen polder arrogance. That's that sort of feeling towards the outside, we can solve all your water problems, and our water problem's not a big issue. We've got that covered. Fully acknowledge Netherlands' fossil fuel dependence and its global carbon footprint. Guard the connection between adaptation and mitigation vigorously. That would mean, I actually have to, that would mean that every project has to account for and mitigate scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, including the funding sources. So, you know, bring it out in the open. If Shell and similar companies are the basis for adaptation measures, they're funding them essentially, then that's a problem. Everyone knows the Dutch water narrative, but there's also a Dutch social housing narrative, starting with the Woningwet van 1901. Weave the stories of water, renewable energy, managed retreat, social housing, research and industry, jobs, cross-border planning into a comprehensive narrative and development strategy. We could call that the Dutch Green New Deal or the Dutch Green Blue New Deal. Imagine a bright future for Terpland, anchored by 2 or 3 research triangles embedded in flourishing regional cross-border cooperation with Germany and Belgium. And I think that's it